Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Citizens United. And to kind of lay this out, there is this argument from the progressive left. And it goes like this, okay? It says that corporate campaign funding leads to political corruption. Therefore, we need to overturn Citizens United. And at first glance, this argument actually makes sense because if if a corporation is funding the campaign of a politician, you have to ask yourself, why are they willing to do that? What is the corporation? What motivates that corporation to fund the campaign of the politician? Well, the motivation is that the corporation expects kickbacks, right? In other words, the corporation expects that if that politician does win the election, then they're going to go into office and write economic policy that benefits that corporation, right? So if Amazon is funding the campaign of a politician and that politician gets elected, then Amazon expects that politician to lower corporate tax rates so Amazon saves money, right? Or perhaps remove environmental protections so Amazon can save costs on production, right? So again, the argument from the left at first glance kind of makes sense here. It says that we need to get money out of politics to end political corruption, and to do that we have to get rid of Citizens United. But there's an assumption here in regard to Citizens United in particular that is fallacious, okay? And that assumption is that it is Citizens United that causes people to elect corrupt politicians, or that it is corporate funding that causes people to elect corrupt politicians. That's not true at all. It is possible that corporate funding plays into or plays a role in what politicians we elect, but it's not a necessary role. In other words, a conscious voting population could just as easily perceive corporate campaign funding of a politician as a stain on that politician and a stain on the corporation, right? In other words, there's nothing that keeps that demands a voting population vote for the politician who's being funded by the corporation, right? So if you imagine a hypothetical scenario where we did overturn Citizens United, you have to ask yourself what would be required for that to happen, okay? And what would be required is that the voting population would have to elect people who weren't funded by corporations, right? They'd have to elect politicians who weren't expecting to give kickbacks to the corporations who funded their campaigns. In other words, if Citizens United were to be overturned, we would have already effectively nullified the power that Citizens United had in the first place. So it's not Citizens United that's the problem. It's not money in politics that's the problem. The problem is that we, as voters, respect money in politics. we vote for the politicians who are funded by these corporations, instead of looking at that corporate funding as a stain on that politician or as a reason not to vote for them. It's quite simple. In order to overturn the effects of Citizens United, all you have to do is not vote for politicians who are funded by corporations. You don't actually have to overturn Citizens United to vote for those other politicians. It's really simple, right? The thing is that that campaign funding from those corporations provides advertisements, and it provides a candidate the ability to both advertise themselves and make attack advertisements against their opposition, right? But you don't have to listen to those ads, right? You don't have to be influenced by the media that you see. You don't have to be influenced by the polls that say the Democrat or Republican is the only candidate that has a chance to win. In other words, you can vote for that third party. You don't have to vote for the person who's going to be first or second place based on polls. Those polls are there to manipulate you. They are there to make you believe that you have to vote for one of two politicians. And wouldn't you know it, those politicians happen to be coming from two political parties who are very, very often funded by corporations. So my advice is to look outside of your traditional media bubble and find other sources that provide political candidates for you, right? Don't just listen to CNN and Fox News, who give you a cookie cutter Democrat and Republican candidate every election. Look to those third parties. Look to candidates who are not funded by corporations. And that may be a Democrat or Republican. Like, they're not all corrupt. They're not all paid off by corporations. But the fact of the matter is that if we have a ruling like Citizens United that specifically allows corporations to fund political campaigns, then what that tells me is that that money is working right now. And that money is working because voters are choosing to allow it to work. Not because the money exists and the money's funding the campaigns, but because voters are choosing to vote for the candidates that money props up in those advertisements, right? In that mainstream media. So it's really simple. All you have to do to overturn Citizens United is nullify it effectively in your own head by not respecting corporation or politicians who are funded by corporations. So thanks for watching.